What if the most terrifying thing an exorcist ever encountered wasn't a demon, but what that demon seemed to know? Not its voice, not its strength, not the impossible things witnesses claim to see, but a single sentence that, according to one Catholic priest, shattered everything he thought he understood about spiritual warfare. Because if his account is true, then the greatest danger isn't what happens during an exorcism. It's what may have been happening long before anyone realized something was wrong. Tonight, we're stepping inside one of the most controversial ministries in the modern world, following the testimony of a priest who says one encounter changed his life forever. Whether you approach this story with faith, skepticism, or simple curiosity, stay until the end, because every revelation leads to another question. And the most unsettling part isn't where this story begins, it's where it ends. According to Father Chad Ripperger, there was one night he has never been able to forget, not because it was the most violent exorcism he had ever performed, not because it involved the most dramatic physical manifestations, and not because it lasted longer than the countless other rituals he had participated in over the years. It stayed with him for one reason alone. During the ritual, the entity he believed he was confronting stopped speaking to the afflicted person and spoke directly to him. It addressed him by a deeply private name, one almost no one else knew. Then, according to his account, it described a hidden event from his past with such precision that, for a brief moment, he lost his composure entirely. If that experience happened the way he remembers it, then it raised a chilling possibility. Whatever he was facing didn't simply react to the people in the room. It appeared to know them. It had been observing them. And that realization transformed the way he understood every case that followed. Most people imagine exorcisms through the lens of movies. They picture spinning heads, impossible contortions, dramatic shouting, and priests dramatically holding crucifixes into the air while darkness retreats in spectacular fashion. But Father Ripperger insists that reality, at least from his perspective, looks very different. He describes exorcism not as theatrical spectacle, but as exhausting spiritual labor. Sessions can stretch for hours. Some continue across multiple days. Progress is rarely dramatic. Instead, he says, it unfolds through persistence, discipline, and prayer. Yet despite that ordinary rhythm, every so often something occurs that resists simple explanation. And those moments, he believes, are the ones that leave the deepest marks, not only on the person seeking help, but on everyone standing in the room. That realization didn't arrive overnight. Long before he became known for speaking publicly about exorcism, he considered himself a student first. His world revolved around theology, philosophy, and centuries of Catholic intellectual tradition. He immersed himself in the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, studying questions about the soul, free will, and the nature of good and evil. Like many scholars, he believed difficult questions deserved careful reasoning rather than emotional reactions. Faith and reason weren't enemies. They were partners. For years, that framework explained almost everything. Then, according to his testimony, reality confronted him with experiences that books alone had never prepared him to face. His first major possession case challenged assumptions he didn't even realize he held. He expected suffering. He expected psychological complexity. He expected fear. But what he claims he encountered instead was something startlingly intelligent. He says the person he met didn't simply behave erratically. The presence speaking through that individual appeared calm, observant, and calculating. Rather than making wild threats, it focused on something far more personal. It identified a hidden fear from his childhood, one he says he had never shared publicly. In that instant, the question was no longer whether something unusual was happening. The question became far more unsettling. How could anyone in that room possibly know? Whether one accepts his interpretation or seeks another explanation. That moment became a turning point in his own understanding. Because from then on, he says, every exorcism followed a pattern. He began recognizing again and again. The most disturbing element wasn't displays of strength or strange voices. It was strategy. The entities described in his testimony didn't behave like mindless forces. They behaved as if they were attempting to manipulate emotions, exploit fears, and distract the people confronting them. If that perception was accurate, then the battle wasn't simply physical or psychological. It was intensely personal. And that realization would shape everything he later taught about spiritual warfare. But before understanding why he reached those conclusions, it's important to understand something else. Contrary to popular belief, the Catholic Church does not authorize exorcisms casually. According to church practice, extensive investigation comes first. Medical evaluations, psychiatric assessments, interviews, documentation. The overwhelming majority of reported cases never receive authorization for a solemn exorcism because natural explanations must be considered before supernatural ones. Father Ripperger repeatedly emphasizes that distinction, arguing that genuine possession is extraordinarily rare. Yet he also believes that rarity does not mean impossibility. And in his view, the small number of cases that remain unexplained deserve careful attention rather than immediate dismissal. That cautious process exists for another reason as well. Throughout his ministry, he says he encountered people harmed not only by whatever they believed they were experiencing, but well-intentioned individuals who attempted rituals they were never trained or authorized to perform. According to his account, enthusiasm alone is not protection. Sincerity alone is not authority. From his theological perspective, exorcism is not a personal contest between two individuals. It is an act performed within the sacramental authority of the Church. Remove that framework, he argues, and the risks increase dramatically. Not because courage disappears, but because confidence without preparation can become dangerous. Yet even that wasn't the lesson that changed him most. Because over hundreds of reported cases, another pattern emerged. One, that he believes almost everyone misunderstands. Popular culture often imagines dramatic gateways into darkness, secret societies, ancient rituals, elaborate ceremonies. But Father Ripperger argues that, in his experience, the stories people brought into his office were rarely so dramatic. Instead, they often began with something surprisingly ordinary, a decision that seemed insignificant at the time, a curiosity, a habit, an unresolved wound, something so small that years later, many people barely remembered it. And according to him, that gradual progression is precisely what makes it so difficult to recognize until much later. That belief led him to focus less on extraordinary evil and more on ordinary choices. He frequently speaks about spiritual habits, forgiveness, prayer, confession, and moral discipline. Not because he believes these eliminate every hardship, but because he sees them as forms of protection. Whether someone shares his theology or not, his broader observation reflects a familiar human truth. Small decisions repeated over time often shape lives far more profoundly than dramatic moments ever do. But in Father Ripperger's worldview, those small choices carried consequences, extending far beyond psychology. He believed they formed patterns that unseen realities could exploit. Among the themes he returns to repeatedly is the idea of hidden wounds. According to his understanding, unresolved pain creates vulnerabilities. Fear left untouched. Anger never released. Guilt carried in silence. These, he argues, become the places where temptation finds its easiest path. Interestingly, even outside religious traditions, psychologists often describe unresolved trauma as influencing future behavior in ways people don't consciously recognize. But Father Ripperger interprets that dynamic through an entirely spiritual lens. To him, healing isn't merely emotional, it's sacramental. And that's where his perspective begins to diverge sharply from purely secular explanations. Then there is another aspect of his testimony that many listeners find deeply controversial: the claim that spiritual struggles can span generations. He does not describe this as genetic inheritance. Rather, he frames it as patterns, commitments, and consequences passed through families over time. Critics reject that interpretation outright. Supporters point to centuries of religious tradition. Regardless of where someone stands, the idea raises an unsettling question. How much of any family's story begins long before the current generation is born? Even outside theology, historians and psychologists recognize that trauma, beliefs, habits, and behaviors often echo across generations. Father Ripperger simply extends that idea into a spiritual dimension. As his reputation grew, another challenge emerged. Skeptics accused him of encouraging superstition. Believers praised him for speaking openly about realities they felt modern culture ignored. Standing between those reactions, he often returned to the same point. He argued that serious investigation should come before serious conclusions. He acknowledged psychology. He respected medicine. But he also believed some experiences remain difficult to explain within existing scientific models. Whether one agrees or disagrees with that conclusion, it became central to the conversations surrounding his work. And that brings us back to the room where everything changed. Because, according to Father Ripperger, the private name spoken during that exorcism wasn't intended merely to frighten him. It was intended to distract him, to make him question himself, to shift his attention away from the ritual unfolding before him. For a brief instant, he admits, it worked. Then he says he remembered something that became the foundation of every case afterward. Whatever knowledge the entity appeared to possess, it did not possess ultimate authority. That conviction, more than anything else, allowed him to continue. But if that single encounter permanently changed the way he viewed evil, something else changed the way he viewed hope. And strangely enough, it didn't happen during one of the most frightening moments of his ministry. It happened during one of the quietest, because what he claims he witnessed after one particular deliverance forced him to reconsider not only the nature of darkness, but the nature of grace itself. And that is where the story becomes even more unexpected. If Father Chad Ripperger is correct, then the most extraordinary moments in an exorcism are not the terrifying ones. They are the quiet moments that come after. He says that following one particular case, the room became completely still. The shouting had stopped. The tension that had filled every corner seemed to disappear almost instantly. The person who had moments earlier appeared exhausted and emotionally overwhelmed, slowly opened their eyes, looked around the room, and quietly asked, "Is it over?" According to Father Ripperger, that simple question affected him more deeply than anything that had happened during the ritual itself. It reminded him that behind every disturbing case was an ordinary human being who had endured profound suffering. Whatever explanation someone accepts for those experiences, he says his focus has always been the restoration of the person, not the spectacle surrounding the event. That realization gradually changed the way he viewed his ministry. Early in his work, he believed exorcism was primarily about confronting evil. Years later, he says he came to believe it was actually about witnessing hope. Because every case, no matter how frightening, eventually centered on the same question: can healing overcome despair? From his perspective, the answer was found not in dramatic confrontations, but in quiet perseverance, prayer, and the conviction that darkness does not have the final word. That belief became the foundation of everything he taught afterward. But the cases themselves also taught him another lesson. He says people often expected dramatic miracles, yet real spiritual recovery was usually much slower. Even after what he believed was a successful deliverance, many individuals still faced the difficult work of rebuilding their lives. Relationships needed repair. Emotional wounds required healing. Habits developed over years did not disappear overnight. In his view, the ritual marked a beginning rather than an ending. The deeper transformation came afterward, through daily choices that slowly restored stability and purpose. Because of that, Father Ripperger frequently emphasizes what he calls ordinary spiritual discipline. From his perspective, people often search for extraordinary solutions while overlooking simple practices that shape everyday life. Prayer, reflection, forgiveness, reconciliation, and participation in one's faith community may appear ordinary, yet he believes they build resilience over time. Whether someone shares his religious convictions or not, the broader principle is familiar across many traditions. Consistent habits often produce stronger foundations than dramatic moments of inspiration. Another point he repeatedly returns to is fear. Ironically, he argues that fear itself can become one of the greatest obstacles. Throughout his ministry, he says he learned that panic clouds judgment, while calm allows people to think clearly. He insists that his goal has never been to convince audiences to fear unseen forces. Instead, he hopes people become more aware of the importance of living with purpose, integrity, and hope. In his words, attention should never remain fixed on darkness, because darkness only has meaning when contrasted with light. That perspective also explains why he rarely discusses individual cases in complete detail. Privacy, he says, matters deeply. Every person who seeks help has a story that deserves dignity rather than publicity. Instead of sensationalizing specific encounters, he prefers to describe recurring patterns that he believes reveal larger spiritual lessons, whether listeners interpret those lessons through faith, psychology, or personal reflection. He believes they encourage deeper questions about the human condition itself. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of his testimony is how often he speaks about compassion rather than confrontation. He describes many of the people he encountered not as frightening individuals, but as people carrying immense pain. Some had struggled for years before seeking help. Others had exhausted every explanation they could find. Regardless of the cause of their suffering, he says they deserved patience rather than judgment. That conviction reshaped his understanding of ministry. The goal was never to defeat another person. It was to help someone reclaim peace. As the years passed, Father Ripperger says, one conviction became stronger than all the others. Evil, whatever form one believes it takes, is rarely defeated through dramatic gestures alone. Instead, it loses ground through countless ordinary decisions made every single day. Acts of honesty instead of deception. Forgiveness instead of resentment. Humility instead of pride. Hope instead of despair. According to him, those quiet choices become the true battleground where lives are shaped. Whether you view his experiences as literal accounts of spiritual warfare, symbolic reflections on human suffering, or something in between, his story raises questions that continue to fascinate people around the world. Why do certain experiences leave such lasting impressions? Why do some people describe encounters that challenge their understanding of reality? And why have stories like these persisted across cultures and centuries? Those questions remain open for every viewer to consider. Perhaps that is why accounts like Father Ripperger's continue to attract attention. They are not simply stories about fear. They are stories about uncertainty, belief, resilience, and the search for meaning in experiences that resist easy explanation. Even skeptics often agree on one point. The human mind, human consciousness, and the experiences people report are far more complex than we fully understand. In the end, Father Ripperger says the greatest lesson he learned was unexpectedly simple. Every frightening encounter reminded him not to become obsessed with darkness, but to appreciate the value of light. Every difficult case reinforced the importance of hope over fear. And every person who found peace reminded him why he accepted this demanding ministry in the first place. According to his testimony, that is the truth he wishes more people understood. The story is not ultimately about evil. It is about the possibility of restoration, no matter how impossible that restoration may seem. So, whether you leave this story convinced, skeptical, or somewhere in between, one thing is certain. Questions like these have challenged humanity for centuries, and they continue to inspire debate today. Perhaps the most important response is neither blind belief nor immediate dismissal, but thoughtful reflection. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones that provide all the answers. They are the ones that encourage us to keep asking the right questions.